So everyone, welcome to the Veritas Automata Deep Dive. You have me, Ben Savage, the CEO of Veritas Automata. We've got Saurabh as well. We're coming to you actually from Cincinnati for the first time in a couple of weeks. We're in the same place at the same time. Today, we're going to talk about a little bit of news, a couple interesting papers, and then we're going to talk about the importance of your data and what that means for any machine, well, really any project you're going to do any kind of analytics on, but particularly for GenAI and for machine learning. So what news items did you have for today?
I came across an interesting paper or Sarkar AI from Japan. They released a new method of testing LLMs or using LLMs using Monte Carlo's based street search.
Well, it was really having LLMs coordinate to get the best results. That was like 30% better than any model.
Correct. And it was surprising the way they formulated the thing. The best way to understand what they did was, let's say you have a problem and you have a bunch of LLMs in the room and you're asking, hey, how do you solve this? Right. And each of them gives an answer and you're kind of evaluating which answer has more potential to solve it. So at that point, you're making a decision, should I generate more ideas or go deep into that search space of that idea, right? So it was very interesting use of, different LLMs and not just banking and trying to train one LLM to solve,
because I mean, when we talk about using different LLMs, they were using OpenAI 4.0 or 4.0A.
Yeah.
They were using Gemini and they were using DeepSeek. The 528 version model of theirs. And so that was really interesting how they were coordinating.
Right.
And what caught my eye, and I think I missed it the very first time I skimmed that paper when you sent it, was that they really pulled a lot of this from the DeepMind AlphaGo, which was the first AI to beat someone in Go, which for those of you who don't know, like beating people in chess is kind of easy, relatively speaking, from machine learning, because it's really just, can you calculate all the moves? And then do you have enough compute to estimate what happens over all those possibilities? Go has some, I don't remember the total number, but many multiples of order of complication over top of chess for all the way the moves work. So that kind of branching piece was super, super interesting how they pulled that into this.
Yeah, I mean, they adopted that whole strategy. If you think about solving a problem with different LLM, it's a strategy problem at this point, right? You're kind of debating whether to go this route or that, because everything has a cost associated with token cost, or even going down the wrong rabbit hole, for lack of better analogy. But so this Monte Carlo search, but with an adaptive branching on top of it, I think that was pretty cool to see that happen.
Well, and I think you've got another piece too, right? This is, I think, one of the things people don't talk about enough with the models is, and this is even the challenge of going to the thinking or reasoning models versus the more traditional LLMs, is there's a cost per token. That's how these are all sold right now.
Right.
So that's the first piece, is how many tokens does it take to get your answer? And if you use a reasoning model, it takes that many more tokens. But then there's also for scenarios where the cost of being wrong is more important. And I don't know if this solution is going to be more cost effective. I think it may be able to take you down a path to get you more accurate answers in some scenarios. That still makes me a little twitchy, because now you're taking a probabilistic solution tool, LLMs, and you're putting another probabilistic tool on top of it. At some point, it just turns into Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah, the results right now are on AGI, kind of a benchmark, trying to solve various different problems. It would be interesting to see how this applies to real world problems and see how that goes. Yeah.
Yep.
And the other one which came out is Gemini 3N.
Yeah, which is, and that's from a news perspective, that's the kind of thing that gets me excited, because that's a small model. For those of you who haven't listened to the podcast, I get really excited on things you can run on local devices, whether that's your computer or something like an NVIDIA Jetson you can run at the edge, or you can run multiple ones in the cloud. And so what makes that model a little unique is not only is it small, but it's more multimodal than the other multimodals we've seen, right? It can do text, it can do image, but it also has some built-in speech generation.
Right. And it runs on mobile phones, I'm guessing, right? Or they're targeting.
I think that's where they're targeting. Some of the demos I've seen so far is it's still taking like 14 gigs of RAM, something like that.
So it's really beefed up mobile devices.
I think it would run on a pretty good desktop without needing a super heavy GPU, but it's requiring some compute.
Yeah, and I think I saw some 1-bit model inference toolkits coming out as well. So it's getting more and more simpler, trying to distribute it rather than have it in one central place. I mean, continuing the thought, the red teaming from last year, you sent me a couple of security related, they were very interesting.
Yeah, so I'm going to zig a little bit from the pure LLM AI perspective to probably the one I thought was one of the coolest hacks I've seen in a long time. And I'm going to call it a hack. So for those of you who are in really secure environments, one of the things you spend a lot of time thinking about is how do I air gap everything, right? So there's no way to get data out. Now, the challenge is there's a lot of people with a lot of free time, and there are a lot of ways to exfiltrate data. But this one was cool in that, there was a myth when I was first getting into computing well, I won't say when, but it was long enough ago where you were still using CRTs as monitors, what they called tempest radiation. And that was, I believe, a code name from a particular project where they found it. But at that point in time, you could use a set of antennas if you had the right RF receiving gear, and you could recreate what was on someone's monitor from pretty significant distance away. As you went to more digital technology, those kind of attacks became harder because of the nature of the technology, right? You weren't using analog radios, essentially. You weren't using things that turned into analog radios. And this particular paper had a method where you could then create an image on a screen, if it was at, I believe, 1080p, and just because there was an HDMI cable attached to it, it would emit what's known as a LoRa packet. LoRa is a really cool technology we'll probably talk about at some point in the future that is a very long-range, low-power mesh networking tool. So what this means is now I can, in theory, encode images on a device. When I display them on the screen, this emits LoRa packets that I can now go buy a $40 radio that I can use my phone to go receive that data. So now I've got this air gap solution. Now I can put a very low cost transmitter receiver nearby and then start to mesh that data out. That to me was like, okay, that was really, really cool.
So let me understand this. So you have to code it in a certain way that it emits that LoRa packet?
It's a specific image that then emits the LoRa packet when you display it, right? Because you think about video, because you're going to use that HDMI cable as a transmitter, so you got to send content over that HDMI cable.
It reminds me of embedding messages in images, right? There was some time back, but now
stenography.
So that it's kind of similar, but you are kind of when it passes through the cable, it acts like a antenna and sends the message out. Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was one, just the cool factor of it. But probably the one that's more relevant to what we were talking about with red teaming and stuff is the info flood paper.
Right.
And, I'll wait and show the video at the end.
Yeah, okay.
But that was an interesting one because I think as everyone tries to figure out how to jailbreak models, and we've got to be clear, everyone is that's the continuing problem. Any piece of technology, if you put it in front of human beings, they're going to find out how to push the edges. And particularly if you're going to use these in environments where you've got, let's just say, students or others, they got a lot of free time. They're going to figure out how to get it to do whatever you tell it not to. And this info flood paper was super interesting because the approach was really to use more verbose prompts, is the term I'll use. And I was joking with Saurabh that you create your prompt in consultanese and you don't speak straightly, and that broke a lot of the models out there.
I can see how it happens because they have limited context window, each of the model does, and then they have attention network to even dwindle it down, right? If you fill up the context with something more authoritative and more important kind of sounding messages, they may tend to forget some of the system prompts and the boundaries that have been put in place, right?
Well, and I think it also gets to both the power, and probably we should level set first, is when we talk about that context window, right? When you think about an LLM, you have a system prompt and you have what's been trained into the neural networks. And that's what you're talking about for that context window. Right? That all takes pieces of that up. And if you break beyond it, then it forgets whatever you told it not to do.
Correct. I mean, because it's kind of balancing their attention network, what to pay attention and what not to pay attention. I can see how that happened. I think this kind of leads into the red teaming piece of data, importance of data in the GenAI especially world, right?
We forgot the video. We can't forget the video.
All right.
So, I had some free time this morning. So I had to create a video that kind of summarized a consultant figuring out how to tell people about this paper. So we'll
seeing here is a paradigm shift in adversarial prompt engineering.
By weaponizing volume, effectively leveraging an information overload attack surface to bypass safety guardrails.
And that was just me doing a quick one shot where I asked it to say, how would a consultant describe a summary of this paper?
I mean, the guy in your video looks like an LLM really sweating hard with all of the data coming in its way, right? I mean,
that's what happens. That's what happens. But no, I think, this paper is an important thing. And this is going to show the challenge that we're all going to have about defending just based on the prompts that people ask.
Right.
And it's the nature of language, right? That there are so many ways you can go say something that actually what it reminded me of, did you ever read the book Snow Crash?
I have read a long time ago, yes.
Okay, so if you remember, the whole thing about Snow Crash is they're trying to find these more universal languages.
Yeah.
And the problem is there's a way to go use language to go engineer a lot in that book.
Yeah.
So I think, but to your point where you were getting to, before I had to go back and play with the video, because, it's me, I got to do something like that, was the importance of the data, right? You've got the prompts, but you've got what's most important for any of these before you even get to the prompts is how do you prep and how do you have data ready for any kind of data? I'm going to use the term broadly data project, i.e. if I'm going to do analytics, if I'm going to do reporting, but particularly if I'm going to do machine learning or Gen AI on it.
Yeah. I mean, as I was doing some research on, how does importance of data play with Gen AI, because it's kind of new. We know how to control data quality in traditional machine learning models, because in there you have pretty much a binary or probabilistic, output, right? If you have missing data, your model crashes because it doesn't know how to handle it. But the same problem, if you take it into Gen AI, it will just overlook. That's why it's so good at ignoring spelling mistakes or words that you misplace, because it's kind of assuming what you mean.
Give away my secrets why I work really well with AI.
Yeah. So, so going back, so with the Gen AI, the problem is more amplified. It's not always garbage in, garbage out, but think of hallucination in. Or,
I was going to say it's worse in a way, right? Because if you don't have the data or the data isn't formatted or in the right way, what's the right way to say it? If you don't have all the context carefully thought out in the data, you've given it paths to hallucinate that it might not have had otherwise.
Correct. It's like you are injecting bias and then it's on top of it is hallucinating as well, right? So it's AI at this moment seems like magical. You throw things, you ask questions, but it around the fringes when it's really you are asking detailed question, it's tend to hallucinate because it's losing the context very easily, right?
Yeah.
So if you are trading something like an enterprise RAG and you are throwing more and more documents in there, right, and not being careful, it would start to pick up on material that I call like a gravity or a black hole kind of a concept. Like in most of your document, if you have some boilerplate language, authoritative language, if you do this, contact the admin or this is, proprietary and, whatnot, right? So they start to tend, LLM doesn't know how to, start to focus more and more on all these gravity wells.
I have a real world example of that actually from something I was doing yesterday. Didn't intentionally do it to come up with a real world example, but there was a early IoT company, I forget the name, it was either Revolve or Revolt or Revolut or something like that. They went out of business after about a year, but they had an early smart home hub you could go get. And I was looking them up because they did some really cool tech to use LEDs to communicate with your phone to be able to exchange URLs. So they had a very low cost device, but then they used your phone as the interface. And I needed to show that for another customer project to somebody. And when I typed it in, I was using Google actually. It goes back, well, we don't know who this is, so we're just going to show you info on Azure IoT Hub, which is not the question I was asking.
Right.
And it's like...
So, if you think about LLMs, they are trying, it's also, again, attention-based. That's the central premise behind it, right? If you have a lot of that boilerplate language keeps showing up everywhere, it kind of start to gravitate towards that.
So let's start at like phase 0, right? A company is going to get ready to do some work with AI, whether it's machine learning or Gen AI. What are the first things they need to start doing about getting their data ready to make the project successful?
So, the biggest litmus test I would recommend is to make sure the documents you are putting into the system for ingestion or whatever purposes you are putting in, it has enough context. The LLM knows what it is looking at. And it's not like a couple of slides from middle of a big deck that was kind of cut out for drafting purposes because it was on your shared drive, you uploaded it, now it doesn't know what it is looking at. Because underneath it typically would chunk a large document into pieces and then...
Well, so before we even get to chunking, right, this is that foundation layer where you're going to start to ingest the data that, to your point is, There's one way to use an LLM is just a giant better search.
Right.
And there, it's a little less important because then you can use RAG and you can go get the right ones back.
Yeah.
But if you want to use an AI model to answer specific questions, that first layer is the data, and you've got to make sure that you're getting the right data so that you're not going to have it go off. So if I'm working on, let's just say, preparing future sales decks, I need to have all the sales decks and the templates I'm going to want to use, in addition to what data I may want to have it to populate into those. But I don't want to have engineering decks in that because I may not want it to be able to show specific things from engineering. Or maybe a better example is I don't want the HR data in that same pool of data I'm ingesting.
If you take it even further, higher level up, when you are let's say you do want engineering, but something that you can share with the clients, make sure those are the latest specs. Because if you are uploading without thinking, you could have products which have been discontinued, trained into the fine-tuned into the LLMs already, right? So that hygiene has to be maintained and monitored over time. Let's say 6 months, you've trained it today, you have fine-tuned your LLM, it knows about all the products, and you introduce a new product, you don't know about it. Or you discontinue something, you don't know about it, right? So the responsibility lies with the owner of business owners so that they know to update that model and not magically know about it, right?
Well, and I think the other piece is when you're getting your data organized, that's the other thing you've got to think about that point is what's your access model, right? Who has access to what data? Because that's going to be the one time when you're getting that data ready, before you even start ingesting it, that model is going to determine in the future, if you're using a secured solution, who can see what when. Otherwise, everyone can see everything.
Correct. The role access control and all of that stuff is a pipelining issue, right? How you're going to do that. But again, if you are fine-tuning, you have to be very, very careful because now it has access to everything, right?
And that's probably an argument against fine-tuning in some cases, right? Because, and we've talked about it earlier, but you've got a couple of primary strategies when you're taking an off-the-shelf LLM. If you don't have enough data or time to build your own, you've got retrieval augmented generation and you've got fine-tuning. Fine-tuning, you embed that data actually in the model itself.
And that's, once you've trained it in, it's very hard to get it out. Specifically that piece, you have to go back in time, take a snapshot and remove that data and then retrain it. So it's expensive. So being very careful.
Well, and it's higher risk, just from what we were talking earlier about jailbreaking, right? If it's in the model, someone assumes someone's going to be able to find it.
Correct. You could prompt engineer your way for real,
We just talked about a paper that proved there was a way around it.
No, I'm saying the attackers may prompt engineer and get their piece out, right? Because I think it's to be cautious and not rely on the model to follow all your system is probably the better approach, just to be safe at this point now. But with the RAG, then you can control it a lot better if it is not trained into the model, right? You don't know about it because it's getting the context or the data in real time during the inference itself, right? But with RAG, you have other issues because one of the pieces with RAG is chunking the data, right? The strategy you take for chunking can control your hallucination, the quality of the answers you're getting back. So that's the other thing.
And when you talk about chunking, right? So let's say we're using that example of sales. So I've got 100 slide sales deck.
Right.
In most models, I'm not going to ingest that model as one giant file. I'm going to break it apart in the segments somehow.
Correct.
And when you talk about chunking, that's really how you're defining how am I breaking those pieces up to bring them in.
Correct. And a lot of the strategic or the advantage you get is around that, because it's very business specific. How you break up the large document. Is it by concept? Is it by product? Is it, if you go on to internet and look at RAG, everybody say chunk it in 500 characters or tokens and then go along, right? What happens when you're doing a concept could be overlapped between two different chunks. And when you're doing a retrieval, it may get one piece, but it may not get the other piece into the relevance, right?
And that's a good point, right? There's actually multiple flavors of retrieval augmented generation. There's normal retrieval augmented generation where it's just really bringing those tokens in. It's not really preserving relationships of things, which is challenging because depending on a chunking, it may merge data, which is an opportunity to hallucinate. There's another approach, and these need to be selected based on your business use case and your data, called graph RAG, where you are building a relationship between those concepts and tokens.
My experience with graph RAG is great. Conceptually it's great, but the relationship edge between the two concepts, that's where it kind of gets, you can make some assumptions, right? And what relationship are you going to look for? Because ultimately you will have another AI or a machine learning tool establish those nodes and the edges, right? And you see hey, only look for this edges and, that edges, but it could, that's where it gets more and more, a little bit more complicated. And then, but GraphRag is great,
it's a tool, right? You've got to look at the right thing. And this is where, as you're defining that business problem, there are certain things that so far with GenAI solutions are very challenging. One being, how do I keep things in time series order?
Right.
And there are some models that IBM and others have been working that are more focused. I think Datadog has one as well.
Right.
So there's that problem. But the other problem is like complex reports and tables. I remember the work we were doing on financial reports, and just within a multi-level table to make it so you can actually get an answer out of it, and it didn't play go fish.
Yeah, and we did a lot of work around, ingesting a tables, figuring it out how to make it more readable by LLM. A simple table is easy by LLM standard today, but as soon as you hit any of those financial reporting table, well, they have sub summations happening middle of the table, and then they have the number of rows expand and also the columns expand and reduce based on the same table. Those throws off LLMs really, really quickly, and we did a lot of work around that. Beside that piece of it, the other piece which kind of piqued my interest was that, let's say you ingested some documents today, and then you went on doing that. But let's say your operating procedure changed over time. How do you track that, take it out of the your vector store or the knowledge base out, and make sure it's not answering this HR question from a 6-month-old policy, right? So,
or there's a challenge of, let's say I'm in an engineering type scenario and I've got a new product. How do I make sure if it's a new model of an existing one that I have all the documentation for the old one? So when I'm looking for the -1, I can find that. But when I'm looking for the new version, the improved, the -2, I can find that, because you don't want to remove that data in that case.
Correct.
If you're doing that from an engineering or customer support. Because if you ever had to go through and say, okay, are these parts backward compatible? What part? Well, I've got a -1, so what do I need to go do to fix it?
Right. So this is where it kind of gets more and more, nuanced, and the importance of data start to pop up, because you could have features on your -1 model, same features on -2 model, but with some variation. When you ask a question, where is it answering from, right? The assumptions you made on the -1, does it still apply on -2? That cleaning the data. And again, it becomes very, very business specific. So the way I see with the RAGs or fine tuning, data curation is going to be, very, very important. It was very important in traditional model, because you would spend 70 to 80% of your time just making sure the data is really great, and before you kind of start to train the models, right?
Well, and I think that's the dirty secret of any, whether it's a reporting, analytics, machine learning, Gen AI. If you don't have that data in the right format for the particular problem you're trying to solve, you're gonna have a bad time. But that's where the first 50, 60, 70% of the project may be. And it may not be the fun stuff, right? It might be people manually scanning in documents if you're converting from paper to digital, if you're dealing with old stuff, or if you're dealing with PDFs in the wrong format, you've got to run them and convert them to a format that's useful for what you're doing. And then someone's got to make sure that all that data, at least have a combination of people and tools to make sure that data is usable and valid.
Right.
It's not, you don't have image corruption. You don't have someone's put the one exception in and now it's going to throw everything off.
So, beyond the data piece of it, right, there's also the aspect of it around, monitoring the whole system. What are your chunks which are getting more and more pulled every day? Are they really important, or is it a boilerplate language that's getting pulled every time, right? It's probably fairly easy to build up a tool which goes through your whole repo and pulls out the boilerplate out so that it's not getting influenced, the gravity well of concept, right? The other piece is the concept drift. You may be asking questions today about certain things, and after a couple of months, the questions changes. The concept, you are looking for something else, right? How do you track that over time also becomes an important part of the, the flow as well.
Now, is that context drift something that you run into, assuming that humans are asking the same question every time? If you have your model locked down where it's not learning and you're only doing the RAG and doing that ingestion when you want. Is that still something that is the nature of the model where it can still learn, or?
No, when I mean, the concept drift. So as there are two ends to it. One is people are asking different questions than they were asking 6 months ago. The other piece is that they are asking the documents you are continuously ingesting. If you have a RAG setup, they also drift because you have new projects, new ideas, right? Let's say just AI in general. We were talking about traditional model for 5-6 years. Now it's all GenAI we're talking about. There was a change in interpretation of what AI means. Now, happened.
That's a good point, because where I was coming at it from was thinking about some of the image recognition. If you used a self-learning one, there were a number of scenarios where you could train the model, like for a safety scenario, to make sure someone didn't fall over the edge.
Right.
But if someone very carefully edged right up to it, the model might fail to detect over time.
Right.
Because if they slowly built that in, the model slowly learned the person standing here is okay.
Yeah.
Now they're a little closer to the danger zone. It's still okay because they're not in the danger zone.
Right.
And before you know it, they got into the danger zone and the model went, I didn't notice anything.
And that's where the data audit, the rate taming of the data that's being fed into the model becomes more and more important, right? Any model like that, a regulatory kind of have a flavor to it. Data, cleaning and validating and approving should be a part of the flow, and not just, hey, just scan new files, add it to this folder or whatnot, and you go with it. It's a dangerous precedence for sure.
Well, and I think you were hitting on another thing too. It's not just at the ingest. There's got to be a point, particularly with tools like this, that are both probabilistic and are not having a human generate the answer.
Right.
There's got to be a way to go do that on it, right? You've got to be able to look through that data and say, okay, what are the questions people are putting in? What are their responses?
Yeah.
Does this make sense? Yeah. Is there an issue? Because that may drive a need to go retrain or find an updated version of the model or put new guardrails in,
right?
Or X or Y or Z, depending on what they're finding.
Yeah. I think collecting feedback at each of these tools where generative AI is being used would be really useful to filter out why did he not like the answer or she didn't like this answer, what's going on with that. So it's going to be an ongoing effort, as you see down the line, right, for sure. The other one we were thinking around is the context, right? So LLMs it's not always bad data, but it doesn't know the context from where you're asking the questions. So part of the pipeline is to work with the business and create those contexts. Like if people are asking this, don't just push the question into the RAG pipeline, add additional context based on which template they are asking from. Kind of like a decision tree, bunch of templates. So the LLM now knows that you're coming from financial perspective, so it will be much more, gravitating towards financial documents, right? Versus say HR question, then it goes into a different direction altogether. So,
and I think that gets to one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about too, the two of us, which is about this idea of ontology, which is very closely related. So context is more of how do two concepts relate. Ontology are specific words that are unique to that business or that industry.
Right.
And some industries are not going to have a lot of this, but some are going to have some very, very specific ones.
Yeah. I think that's very important because LLM ultimately is trying to guess what you mean, right? And more context it has a better grasp on what chunks to pick up and how to re-rank them and then produce an answer around it, right? So a lot of this thing it will need to happen as you deploy the product and a couple of releases down the line, it's get fine-tuned. But traceability of that whole flow, right? What's happening, what is leading then LLM to pick up this? What's the score? What is it matching against? Because a lot of the RAG pipelines, involves requerying. So it takes your questions, reformulates in a way that or even if it's a multi-hop kind of a thing, right? You need 5 or 6 different pieces to answer this question. Is it getting done properly, or did it ignore something and hallucinate one of these steps altogether, right?
Well, and I think part of what you hit on, right, is that, so, if you're going to do an LLM project or a GenAI project, first thing starts with organize the data, make sure it is highly relevant to the questions that you intend to ask it. If you're looking for very specific, if you're just going to use it as search, you've got a lot more flexibility. Then you've got to figure out what your ingestion strategy is, particularly how are you going to chunk the data and maintain any key relationships. At that point now, you don't just turn it loose to the masses. What you've got to do is have a group of subject matter experts who can look at that data and say, hey, is this right? Is this wrong? Did it go hallucinate a dinosaur? What's it doing? I think that piece is super, super important. You can't just big bang most of these things without knowing there's going to be a lot of risk, other than using it as a glorified search engine.
Yeah, I mean, even if you think about the documents, are there like conflicting points within the document? Sometimes they do, right? In the front of the document, you said you got to do this way. Towards the end, they changed and do it that way. Now LM doesn't know which one is the right way to do.
So you've read some of those manuals too, where you're going, you just told me to turn this to the left, but before you said turn right.
Yeah. So it's like, it's with any intelligent system, right? It's time like, I don't know what to do at this point, right? So the cleanliness of the data becomes more and more important, right? So, the best way to set up anything with LLM is to be very, very careful with the data, because that step doesn't go away. It looks magical now because the model doesn't fail and gives you something output, right? In traditional world, the model would fail if you have a missing variable altogether, or, it was so rigid that even in a categorical variable, let's say you are sending alphabets, all of a sudden you have an small versus uppercase kind of a thing, it would fail because it doesn't know how to handle it, right? So with LLMs, everything is good.
Well, and you just described everyone who went from their first DOS and Windows computer to all of a sudden you go to a Linux system and all of a sudden it's case sensitive. You're like, it's the same file.
Exactly. So it looks more intelligent, more better, but it's still underneath. It's the same data that governs a lot of this flow. So,
but it's with any project. It's what data do I have and what's my business goal that I'm going to try and work through? And then everything has to be built off those two.
Right. I think with enterprise grade, building wrappers around a lot of these public LLMs, or even if you're just pulling something in Olama and running through this, is probably not the best way. I mean, it's pretty good for an MVP or POC, but as soon as you go into production environment, a lot of these due diligence and rigor needs to be put in before open to the masses.
No, I think that's a great ending point for this, because if you don't get all that right and you want to move beyond the MVP, you're going to have challenges. It's going to hallucinate. It's going to give you wrong answers. It's going to give people data they shouldn't have access to.
Right.
And those are all things you need to spend probably a lengthier time in MVP than you expect to go work through all of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you, Saurabh. I think I'll wrap today. This is a little bit shorter one, but I think this is a super important thing that everyone needs to think about, is their data quality and how they bring that into the system.